Well, look, much of the press conference was fairly predictable, largely what you'd expect. Both Prime Ministers ran through the burgeoning cooperation between Australia and India on a number of fronts, whether that's education, professional services, migration, and of course, perhaps most recently, defence and security ties, which have really come along in leaps and bounds recently. So you did get the sense of a relationship that is on the fast track as the strategic interests of both Australia and India rapidly converge. There was, however, one very notable note that was quite different when the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, quite deliberately and publicly raised a spate of attacks on Hindu temples in Melbourne, calling it very distressing for the people of India. Now, the history here is quite fraught and difficult. What we've seen most recently in Melbourne is elements of supporters of the state of Khalistan. They're essentially Sikhs homeland in India, somewhere near the state of Punjab. A number of people have been pushing for independence. There have been referendums in Melbourne and most recently about 3 attacks, supposedly by pro-Khalistan elements in Melbourne. Now, the Indian government has been quite angry about this. It's been quite forceful in its language. It's been pressing the Australian government to try and stop these so-called referendums from going ahead and to do more to protect Hindu temples against attacks like this, particularly graffiti attacks. But the government has basically thrown up its hands and said, look, there's very little we can do because in the end the referendum has no legal standing. People have the right to protest in Australia. We appreciate this is a sensitive issue for you, but there's very little we can do about it. I think what Mr Modi's statement makes very clear is that the Indian government now at the very highest level is signalling its displeasure at what's happening here and indicating that they want the Australian government potentially to do more, not just in terms of protecting temples, but also sending a signal that they'd like the Australian government to do what it can or to do more to try and discourage the Khalistan movement in Australia. They see it as a core question of sovereignty. So interesting and noteworthy that Mr Modi raised that so deliberately and so publicly today.
Interesting indeed. And Stephen, security cooperation has been a big theme throughout this trip. Tell us some of the key points and what's been achieved.
Yeah, that's right. Security has been a big element of this trip, and there has been a lot that has been achieved in recent months and years. We've seen since 2014 the defence relationship get markedly closer as the two countries have expanded bilateral training exercises. Now what we're seeing is an expansion into multilateral exercises. So Australia this year is going to host for the first time Operation Malabar. That's a naval exercise with the US, India, Australia and Japan. That's a significant development. On top of that, Mr Albanese revealed yesterday when visiting INS Vikrant, India's first domestically built aircraft carrier, that India would take part in Talisman Sabre. That's a massive multi-country exercise off the coast of Queensland involving more than 17,000 personnel. That's also happening this year. India's participation, again, a clear signal that Australia and India are really drawing much more close together on the defence, in the defence space. And of course, this is not entirely, but it is largely driven by a shared anxiety about China's swelling military might and the implications that has for Australia in places like the Pacific and for India in places like the Indian Ocean, where it is the resident power.
And finally, what's next on the agenda for Prime Minister Anthony Albanese?
Well, as has now been very well reported, Anthony Albanese is going to leave India and head for the United States. In particular, he's going to go to the west coast, to San Diego, where he's expected to, effectively on Monday or Tuesday our time, announce finally the details of the AUKUS submarine push between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States. We will finally get the so-called optimal pathway for Australia as it pursues this enormously complicated and ambitious project to develop nuclear-powered submarines. Now, it's been well reported that Australia is likely going to fill the gap between its existing submarines, the conventional Collins class, and this new submarine that it's going to develop with a US submarine called a Virginia-class submarine. Perhaps 3 or even 5 apparently may be purchased. The full details, though, haven't yet been formally announced. We'll have to wait a few more days for that when Mr Albanese meets Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, and Mr Biden in San Diego in just a few days' time.